Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
I did not plan to make a scene at my father's retirement party because I have spent a lifetime smoothing things over and making sure other people felt comfortable even when I did not. But when he lifted his glass and said, in that warm public voice he saves for donors and golf buddies, to the son who carried on my legacy, and the room swelled with that polite laughter people do when they want to be seen approving of the right person, I felt something in me go still. Not angry in the way that explodes, but clear in the way that decides, and I stood up, pushed my chair back the way you do when you have already chosen the next step, walked to him with a calm I did not expect to have, and handed him an envelope while I said, interesting. Since this came for your legacy yesterday, and when I watched his mouth tighten, about the width of a thumbnail, I knew he understood enough to feel the first edge of worry. If you think I am being dramatic, I get it, because you probably were taught, like me, that family moments should be preserved under glass and handled with careful fingers. But the truth is that this line about the legacy has been a recurring line in my life for so long that I can recite it with the same rhythm he uses at banquets and award dinners, a line that always points toward my brother Mark like a spotlight that never burns out, while I am left on the edge of the stage holding the chords and listening to people say how impressive it is that the family produced a leader. And yes, I know this sounds petty in the abstract, but it does not feel abstract when you have spent years inside the business building the systems that actually keep the doors open, the unglamorous processes that reduce returns and keep the accounts square, while someone else walks the tours and shakes the hands and gets called the future. I did not hate Mark, and I still do not, because brothers are not straight lines in a story. They are habits and shared jokes, and the memory of him falling off the backyard swing and grabbing my wrist so hard he left a mark, which is the kind of thing that makes you protective even when you are irritated. But the problem with Mark is that he learned to live comfortably under the story my father wrote, the one where men lead and women support, where rational decisions conveniently map to whatever keeps my father at the center of praise. And for years I told myself that if I worked hard enough and kept my head down and made things better, the merit would eventually speak. Yet merit does not speak when someone else holds the microphone and your name never leaves his mouth. Do you know the kind of jaw clench you get when you hear someone retell your work as his work, not once or twice, but on the regular? At chamber breakfasts and alumni fundraisers and holiday dinners where the adults ask careful questions while kids look at their phones, and you keep sipping water because if you say anything you will sound jealous, and if you stay quiet you are being mature. And if you try to show receipts you are petty, and all roads lead to the same shrug from your father who says, honey, no one keeps score like that, even while he keeps perfect score when the points go to Mark, because that is the merry little trick of legacy. It is a scoreboard only the winner can read. I am telling you this because people think the envelope was some sudden nuclear option, like I woke up that morning and decided to blow up a party, when in reality it was the end of a long, boring road paved with small erasures. The kind that do not make headlines, but do bleed you out over time, like when my father told the new CFO that I was great with people and suggested I take on culture initiatives, right after I finished the vendor audits that saved the company from a compliance mess. Or the time Mark botched a regional rollout and my father said we would share responsibility because the family wins together, which sounded noble until the bonus numbers came out and only one of us got the winner's cut. So when I stood there with the envelope, I was not a live grenade at a family gathering. I was a woman who had run out of ways to swallow the same story, and because I know how my father operates, I knew the only language he respects is public perception. The nods from the people whose opinions he collects like trophies, which is why I did not ask him to step aside to talk, and I did not message him later like a child trying to be reasonable, and I did not wait for an empty conference room on Monday, because none of those moments would land where they needed to land, and this did, in front of his carefully selected audience, with the catered sliders he loves and the slideshow of black and white photos playing behind him like a museum tour of a life edited for applause. He took the envelope, and I could see the thought cross his face, not panic yet, more like annoyance, the kind he has when a meeting goes long, and he tried a little joke to keep the room comfortable, something about me always keeping him on his toes. And people chuckled because people are trained to follow cues, but I did not smile, and I did not take the mic, and I did not explain, because there is a power in letting silence do the work when someone finally has to meet the thing he has been avoiding, and silence stretched just long enough for him to break eye contact and slide a finger under the flap. I know you want to ask what was inside, and I know that is the whole point of this story, but I am not going to open it for you yet, because the truth is that what was inside only matters when you understand how it got to me at all. And why I waited until this particular night to put it in his hands, and why I knew it would land with the weight it deserved. Not because I enjoy suspense for its own sake, but because the timing is everything when you have lived your entire life on someone else's timeline, and for once I wanted him to feel what it is like when the story does not pause for his comfort. You should also know that the envelope did not come out of nowhere. It arrived the day before in a package I almost left on the porch because I was late and had groceries sweating in the back seat. And if you have ever had one of those odd life moments where something small and unremarkable shows up and then, hours later, it is the hinge that swings the whole door, you will understand why I stared at the return address for a good long beat. Because I recognized the name and I recognized what it meant, and the decision practically made itself once I read the first page. So yes, I handed it over at the party, and yes, I was steady, and yes, he started reading right there as forks paused and chatter thinned. But I will tell you what led to that package, and what used to keep me up counting the ways I let this go on. And how I finally stopped counting and started planning, because that is the part no one in that room saw coming. Not my father, not Mark, not the partners who think they know every corner of this family, and certainly not the people who laughed at the legacy line like it was harmless. And when I finish, you will understand why the first page stole his smile, and why the second page took the color from his voice, and why the third page will not let him sleep tonight. If you have ever sat through one of those family dinners where the stories line up like trophies on a shelf and somehow every single one with a shine on it is handed to the same person, then you already know the slow grind that shapes a daughter into a ghost at her own table. Because as far back as I can remember, I was the dependable one who fixed the messes and reconciled the accounts and patched the leaks before anyone noticed the floor was wet, while my father narrated our life as if the business rested on the instincts of my brother and the noble sacrifices of a man who never missed a chance to clap his own back. And I kept swallowing it, because that is what happens when you learn early that speaking up will be called drama. Yet your silence will be called maturity, which sounds virtuous until you realize it is just another word for erasure dressed in manners. There were the promotions that quietly floated past me like balloons released to the ceiling because I was told I was invaluable right where I was, which is corporate code for you do the work no one thanks you for while the titles go to the people who tell a better story. And I remember the budget year when I reduced vendor chargebacks through a contract rewrite I bled over on evenings that smelled like takeout and spreadsheets, only to watch my father beam at a breakfast meeting as he explained that Mark's leadership had driven a new era of operational discipline, and the men in jackets nodded along while I sipped coffee and tried to be the kind of adult who is not bitter. And I kept telling myself I did not need the spotlight because results live on the ledger, except ledgers can be spun when the spokesman is charming and you are the one they call emotional. Mark would swing by my office door with his thumbs hooked in his pockets and thank me for being a team player, which was not malicious so much as comfortable, the way a favorite chair is, because he grew up fed on the same story my father loved. The one where the son is the heir and the daughter is the helper, and I cannot even say he invented the idea that I was somehow less suited for real leadership, because it was spooned into both of us and reinforced in 1,000 tiny ways, like the time our father called me into his office to thank me for organizing a safety compliance audit that saved us from penalties, and then added that my gift was soft power, which he said with a smile that expected my gratitude. While the next week, he introduced Mark to a group of partners as the backbone of operations, and I had the misfortune of standing close enough to hear the phrase land as if it were fact. I want to say I confronted him, but I didn't, not then, because there is a calculus women do that no one writes down, where you measure the cost of being labeled difficult against the cost of watching your own work disappear. And for a long time I kept choosing the path that let everyone keep liking me, which I now realize is just another way of keeping the system comfortable, Yet there were little rebellions that kept my spine from turning to mush. Like the afternoon, I built a changelog that required sign-offs at each handoff with timestamps and author fields that could not be altered without leaving a footprint, which I installed under the umbrella of compliance so no one would argue. And even though my father did not see what I had done, I knew I had just made it impossible for anyone to retell certain stories without bumping into a record that said otherwise. It is funny how small technical choices can feel like tiny acts of revenge when the world insists on pretending your contributions are personality traits instead of labor, because that changelog went on to save us from a lawsuit and, more importantly for me, it built a trail I would later need, though I did not know it yet, and I kept layering these quiet safeguards into the bones of the business, archiving emails with retention rules that could not be casually purged, exporting clean copies of contracts to a repository outside the main network that my father did not think to monitor, because he never cared about the plumbing, only the speeches, and every time he stood at a podium and praised the son who carries our legacy, I added one more lock to a cabinet only I could open. The thing with long tolerance is that it rarely snaps in one loud crack. Instead, it frays until one day a single careless moment slices the last thread, and mine came when a regional manager retired and, during his farewell, my father joked into a microphone that I was the company therapist who kept morale high while Mark ran the hard numbers. And I looked around at the clapping and realized no one would ever hand me a different role if I kept playing the part that made their version tidy, and that night I went home, poured coffee that tasted like decisions, and started making a different plan. Not a tantrum, not a public explosion, but a set of steps that would make it impossible to keep pretending I was an accessory. That plan started with reindexing the document archive for anything with my name and marks on the same thread, and then it grew teeth when I found a handful of emails where the narrative had shifted just enough to credit him for proposals I had written. Which was not a crime, just an insult, but insults add up until they start to look like strategy, and then I hit one message from a former employee named Aaron who had left 2 years earlier under a cloud of rumors about performance, and in that message she apologized for not speaking up back when something ugly was happening and said she had kept a box of files because she believed the truth might matter someday, and she asked if I was ready to see it. I stared at her note for long enough to feel the small hairs on my arm say pay attention, and when I called her she sounded nervous in the way people do when they have been punished for telling the truth before. And she told me she had documents she was not comfortable emailing, and she said there were memos that would make me furious and also make me feel less crazy, because they proved the game had been rigged in ways I had suspected but could not prove. And I told her I would drive to meet her, but she insisted on mailing the box because she did not want to be seen anywhere near our building, and that was when I realized we were not just dealing with sloppy credit theft and garden variety misogyny. We were stepping into the territory where people lie in ink and expect the ink to be permanent. While I waited for that package, I did something that sounds small, but felt like reclaiming a piece of my spine, because I finalized a policy update that locked senior approvals behind compliance review rather than executive override, which meant my father could no longer grease anything through with a nod and a wink, and I announced it as a transparency measure with a smile that told everyone we were stepping into an era of clean accountability, and I watched my father grin and say he loved initiative while his eyes did the quick math of someone who recognizes a door has quietly closed, and I went back to my desk feeling a steadiness I had not felt in years, because even if nothing else happened, I had blocked his favorite hallway. I understand that none of this sounds spectacular in the Hollywood sense, but when your whole life has been a patient inventory of little humiliations, you learn to savor the revenge that looks like structure. The revenge that lives in policy and receipts and locked drawers, because while he took the stage and called it legacy, I was laying a foundation that would not care how loudly he spoke, and by the time Aaron's package landed on my porch, I had already moved the center of gravity away from his voice and toward the paper that tells the truth even when the storyteller forgets how, which is why the night before the party I could sit with the lid open, breathe through the anger, and choose a move that would not only protect me, but changed the air in the room he thought he owned. And the first step of that move was simple and pointed and, yes, delicious, because I pulled every file he had ever signed that touched my work, printed clean copies with the change logs attached, and placed them in a folder marked with a single word he would hate to see under the lights. When I finally opened Aaron's box, I did not expect to find anything I had not already suspected in some quiet corner of my head, because suspicion has lived with me for years like a tenant who pays late but never leaves. Yet as soon as I saw the first folder labeled with my name and a date from the year my father told a room of partners that I was stepping back from operations to focus on culture, I felt that dull click of recognition that arrives when something ugly lines up too neatly, and I pulled out a memo that used corporate language to say something simple and vicious, which was that a series of irregular vendor credits had been approved by me without proper controls, and that a review would be needed to correct the process that had unfortunately damaged margins and trust, even though I could see, in 3 attached emails and a signed change authorization, that those credits had been initiated by a friend of my father's and pushed through by him under executive override, with my name placed at the bottom as the sponsor because the system still showed my old ownership for that workflow. I read it once, then again, slower, because I wanted to make sure I was not doing that thing where anger fills in gaps that the evidence does not cover, and then I moved to the spreadsheets that Erin had printed from the accounting system before she left, which showed tidy adjustments that brought the month back into line as if nothing strange had happened, except the offset entries were tucked into a project code that looked like any other, and the authorization field showed a digital signature belonging to Mark, time-stamped after hours on a Friday, with a comment that referenced a verbal approval from my father, and no, that is not a crime in the cinematic sense. But it is a play that keeps reputations clean while the mess is assigned to the person least likely to fight about it, and I realized in a flash of tired clarity that all those years I had been told I was too sensitive, I had actually been accurate, just outnumbered. The next folder was worse in a different way because it carried a draft of a letter to our board's audit committee, never sent, where my father had outlined the need to restructure responsibilities due to recurring compliance gaps associated with my area, which would have been hilarious if it were not so brazen, given that the very gaps he named were the ones I had closed with the change logs and the approval locks. And stapled to that draft was a note in his handwriting asking our outside counsel whether a personnel change would reduce exposure, with my name underlined twice, as if that underlining could make me into a problem he could simply move off the page, and I sat there at my kitchen table feeling the kind of cold that does not need weather. Because it dawned on me that the long game had not been to ignore me, it had been to erase me and then blame the empty space on my supposed shortcomings. I called Erin right then, not to interrogate but to thank her for keeping what she kept when she had every reason to throw it all away, and she told me her story in a flat voice that comes from being tired of telling it. How she raised a concern about those vendor credits and was told she misunderstood, how she flagged the mismatch between the approval trail and the system owners and was told, very politely, that she was not a culture fit, and how she left with a box because she did not trust the cleanup that followed, and I listened without promising anything because I will not make promises in the heat of fresh anger, but I told her she was not crazy and that I was going to handle it. And she said she believed me because I was the only one who ever answered her question straight. Once I had the documents spread out and the timeline mapped, the plan did not arrive like lightning, it arrived like a checklist, because revenge dressed up as drama is satisfying for a minute, but revenge that looks like order keeps paying dividends. So I scanned everything to a drive with a simple structure that a lawyer could understand on a rough day. I printed clean copies and used my own change log to append the exact points where the paper trail diverged from the truth, and then I did something that might sound paranoid, but is simply practical if you have ever watched a story get rewritten after the fact. Because I packed a second set into a plain envelope with no return address and walked it to the mailbox addressed to a reporter at the local business journal who has never once flattered my father in print, and, before you worry about legal exposure or fairness, I will tell you I included a cover note that said to call me for context before running anything, which was both responsible and strategic, since context is the difference between gasoline and light. I was not done, because part of me still respects process even when it has not respected me, and I wanted to make sure that if my father tried to push this back into shadows, I would have a switch I could flip that would turn every light on at once. So I drafted a short, dry email addressed to the audit committee chair with the subject line "Records Preservation," which is the sort of phrase that makes people sit up straight, and I did not send it, not yet, because timing matters and I wanted the first read of those pages to happen in his hands, but I scheduled the email with a delayed send to land an hour after the party started, which gave me a cushion in case I changed my mind, but also meant I would not have to punch the button with shaking fingers while standing in a crowded room. I also changed one small thing inside the company that my father would not see until it bit him, which was the escalation path in our incident response plan, moving legal counsel into the first wave instead of the third, and yes, I had authority to do it. And no, I did not need permission, and the policy update went live with the routine batch that night, so by the time the party rolled around, the system itself would enforce a level of scrutiny he is always considered optional, and this is where you can roll your eyes at me for being bureaucratic, but I have learned that the cleanest revenge is the kind that looks like plain procedure, because people like my father are fluent in charisma but allergic to paperwork with backbone. Before midnight, I sat with the thickest of the memos, the one that tried to hang the blame for the credits on me, and I wrote a simple annotation in the margin referencing the changelog entry that proved otherwise. And I placed that memo on top of the stack in a plain envelope with his name on it, not a flourish, just a label he could not pretend not to see. And I tucked the rest behind it in the order a careful reader would follow if he wanted to understand exactly what had been done and by whom. And as I slid the envelope into my bag, I felt something I almost did not recognize, which was relief more than rage, the relief of knowing that when I stood up the next evening I would not be improvising. You might ask, why not confront him privately? Why not bypass the spectacle and try once more to talk to the man who taught me to ride a bike and to return phone calls? And I asked myself that too while the coffee cooled, and the answer is plain and not pretty. Because men like my father only understand stakes when other people are in the room, and every private conversation we have ever had about fairness ended with him promising to do better, and then doing exactly the same. So if you are waiting for me to say I wanted to humiliate him, I will be honest and say I wanted him to feel accountability, which looks the same as humiliation when you have never had to feel it before. By the time I set an alarm and turned off the kitchen light, the framework was built, copies secured, a journalist primed, a preservation email ready to fly, a policy that would keep anyone from quietly deleting anything inconvenient, and an envelope packed with pages that did not need my voice to explain them, and I went to bed knowing that the next time he raised a glass to the son who carried the legacy, the room would finally have the receipts, and the only question left was how he would look when he saw the first line on the first page, which said, in plain company font, that the author of the override had been him. By the time the room filled with people who had been practicing their smiles and their handshakes for decades, I had already made peace with the fact that I was not there to be gracious or to paper over old cracks with one more round of polite applause. Because I had decided that if my father wanted a stage, then I would let him have it, and if he wanted an audience, then I would let him have that too, but I would also make sure that when he delivered his little fable about legacy, he would have to do it while holding the weight of what he had written into other people's lives, and that is why I kept my voice even and my posture ordinary and my conversation light, answering questions about work and about family with the soft laugh I have learned to use when I want people to underestimate me, all while the clock moved toward the moment he lives for. That moment when he taps the glass and stands tall and waits for the hush that tells him he is about to be praised for being exactly who he says he is. I watched him do the usual prep routine that looks like spontaneity if you have never seen it before, the quick check with the event coordinator, the word in the ear of the MC who would set him up, the whispered reminder to my brother to stand to his left when the toast landed, and none of it hurt the way it used to because I had already shifted the center of gravity away from performance and toward paper. And when the introductions rolled and the slideshow warmed the room with curated moments that made him look inevitable, I let it happen without flinching because I knew the envelope in my bag was not a bluff, and I knew that the delayed email sitting in my outbox would land whether I had a surge of courage or not. And I also knew that the journalist I had quietly invited would not waste the evening on small talk if the pages ended up telling the story as clearly as I believed they would. You could call what I felt nerves, but that is not quite right, because the shaky part of me was not the part that wanted to act. The shaky part was the old reflex that always tried to rescue him from consequences. The one that remembered the first time he forgot to pick me up from practice, and the way I told myself a better story to save him from embarrassment, yet I kept that reflex on a leash by listing in my head every time he had taken my work and turned it into a compliment to someone else, every time he had asked for my patience while rewarding another person's impatience, every time he had called me a peacemaker as a way to keep me from demanding fairness. And by the time the MC said my father's name with the flourish of a man introducing a beloved institution, my resolve had the clean, practical shape of a plan that no longer needed adrenaline. He started soft, the way he does when he wants to sound humble, thanking my mother for her patience and his mentors for their advice, and the team for putting up with his standards. And then he told the old story about the rough early years that always plays well with people who like to believe success is a morality tale, and, because he is practiced, he did not hurry. He let the crowd lean into the rhythms they expected, which made it easy for him to glide into the line he loves, the one about legacy. And when he said, "To the son who carried on my legacy," I felt that old familiar shift in the room, a tilt toward Mark that erased me with a smile, and I let the laughter crest and fade, and then I stood, not with a dramatic scrape of chair legs, but with the simple decision to be visible, which, in that moment, was its own kind of rebellion. I walked to him slowly enough that he had time to understand I was not coming to hug him or to whisper a joke, and when he saw the envelope in my hand, his smile did not falter so much as freeze. Which is what happens when a man who has never had to read a room discovers the room is reading him, and I said, in a voice that carried without being sharp, "Interesting, since this came for your legacy yesterday," and I placed the envelope in his palm and stepped back, resisting the urge to say another word, because I wanted him to be the one to open it in front of the same faces that had been trained to applaud on cue, and for a beat he tried to charm his way around it, made a quip about me keeping him honest, and several people chuckled to be polite. But the journalist I had invited did not laugh, and neither did the board member who understands the phrase records preservation, and in that quiet, the seal tore. He looked at the first page long enough for me to watch his eyes move to the signature line where his name sat next to the override, and then he moved to the attached changelog entry. And then he flipped to the memo addressed to the audit committee proposing the restructuring that would have moved me out of the way, and I could see the tiny tells I know better than anyone, the tight swallow, the blink that takes one beat longer than normal, the half glance toward Mark as if a brother could help explain what a father had signed, and I did not relish the discomfort so much as finally refused to cushion it, because this was not about vengeance for its own small satisfaction. It was about returning weight to a man who had never had to carry any. And I let the silence do what explanations cannot. While he stood there, the delayed email left my outbox and landed where it needed to land, which meant that somewhere behind him, while the caterer circled with trays and the DJ watched for cues, the audit chair's phone lit with a subject line that would make him politely step away from whatever conversation he was in. And a copy of the same note slid into the general counsel's inbox, because the policy I had published the night before made legal the first stop instead of the third, and on another desk a notification pinged at the Business Journal where a reporter who values paper over charm now had enough to justify staying late, and you can call that choreography if you want, but to me it was just the same kind of planning I have always done, this time aligned with my own interests for once. My mother, who has trained her face to support whatever keeps peace for one more evening, reached for a smile, and then changed her mind when she saw the line between my father's brows. And Mark tried the sort of confused laugh you use when you believe the joke is on someone else and you are trying to be a good sport. But his eyes darted down as my father moved to the second document where the offsets and the project code told a story that required no narration, and at our table a partner who loves governance more than he loves golf cleared his throat and stared at his water as if it might explain how a clean company keeps its margins without dirty tricks, and I stood with my hands at my sides and refused to rush the moment. Because rushing is what you do when you want to spare people from the shape of what they have done. I will not pretend I felt nothing. I felt a grief for the years I did not stand up sooner and a second grief for the version of my father I will never meet. The one who would have looked at the first document and said he was sorry before I had to force him to be, but I did not let those feelings make me generous, because generosity would only rebuild the illusion I was finally tearing down. So instead, I turned slightly so that the journalist could see my face if she needed to read it, and I gave my father the last piece of courtesy he ever earned from me, which was the room to react without me filling the air, and when he reached the memo with his note about reducing exposure, the one with my name underlined twice, the one that said out loud the plan he thought would never be traced back to him, he stopped pretending to smile. The room, which has learned to follow his cues, tried to decide what to do without them, and that is when I gave the evening its only nudge, because I stepped to the microphone he had just used to declare the family story, and I said, in the plainest voice I own, that I would be in the lobby if anyone from the board wanted to talk about process, and that copies of relevant materials were available upon request, and then I put the microphone down and I walked away without looking back, which was the most satisfying exit I have ever made in my life, not because I left him stranded, although I did, but because I finally chose myself over the comfort of people who never chose me, and as the door closed behind me I heard nothing, which told me everything, and when my phone vibrated with the first reply from the audit chair, I did not open it yet, because the only thing that mattered was the look that would be on my father's face when he reached the last page. I know you have been waiting for the part everyone tries to skip to, the simple question of what exactly I put in my father's hand that made the smile fall off his face like a mask that finally cracked, and I will not drag it out anymore. Because the contents were not magic and they were not even exotic, they were, in a way that should make all of us a little angry, boring and obvious, and written in the same tidy language that pretends to be neutral, a stack of documents that showed, in clean entries and polite memos, how executive overrides had pushed through irregular vendor credits tied to a friend's company, how end-of-month offsets had been tucked into a project code to shore up margins just enough to make forecasts sing, how an internal draft to the audit committee framed the pattern as an administrative gap in my area, and how a personnel plan underlined my name twice as the proposed solution, all of it initialed or time-stamped in ways that linked back to my father and on one crucial after-hours Friday, to Mark, which meant the story my father loved to tell about legacy was not just puffed-up pride, it was a shield for corner-cutting dressed as genius and a convenient plan to lay the cost at my feet when the music stopped. What happened at the party was not a dramatic confession or some movie scene where a patriarch throws his hands up and begs for forgiveness, because men like my father do not do that unless a judge is present, and even then they phrase it like an inconvenience. So what happened was quieter and, in a way, more satisfying, because it looked like process waking up in real time. The audit chair stepped into the hallway and called me with a voice I have only ever heard in crisis meetings, measured and careful, and he asked me to send digital copies with metadata intact, which I had already assembled and secured on a drive that lived outside the reach of any midnight cleanup. Then legal pinged me with a note about records holds that I did not need to explain, because the policy update I had pushed the night before forced their involvement from the first minute, and the journalist, who had watched me place the envelope into my father's hands without performing, texted to confirm that she had the package and would not run a word without my context, an agreement that was both tactical and fair, and while the room inside tried to decide whether to keep clapping or sit down, I sat on a lobby bench and wrote a short, calm email to the board summarizing the attachments they were about to receive. The hours that followed were not glamorous, they were administrative in a way that would bore anyone who has never lived through a real reckoning. Because accountability looks like scheduled calls and intake interviews and someone from outside counsel asking for chain of custody details on files that no one thought mattered last week, and I answered every question like a person who has nothing to hide. Because I did not, and I did not embellish or reach for old grievances to sweeten the mix, I stuck to dates and signatures and the way the change log showed my earlier controls, and I politely refused to speculate about intent, because intent is what people use to distract from conduct. And conduct was already printed in 14 pages with 2 exhibits that a first-year auditor could follow without coffee, and by midnight I had done the one thing I promised myself I would do if I ever took a swing this big, which was to set the bat down and let the field show the dents. The next morning brought what it always brings when truth touches power in a place that has been pretending to be clean, a wave of reaction that tried, for a minute, to recast me as disloyal or opportunistic or even hysterical. And I let that wash over me without grabbing a towel, because it came from people who needed the story to be tidy and comforting and male. And because it lasted exactly as long as it took the first board member to open the PDFs and realize that if they circled the wagons, the circle would include their own reputations, and once that calculation landed, the tone shifted into something that sounded like professionalism, which is not the same as contrition, but will do when you are building a record. And by the end of the day, the board had appointed an outside firm to review the transactions. My access to the underlying systems had been elevated rather than revoked. And the policy locks I had installed became the backbone of a formal preservation order that made it impossible to bury the mess under the rug he has been standing on for 20 years. I avoided my mother's calls for a day because I wanted to give her time to choose a side, and when I finally answered, she did what women in her position have been trained to do. She asked if there was a way to make this a misunderstanding, to keep Dad's retirement clean. And I told her, in a voice that did not waver, that the retirement would be exactly as clean as the books, which she understood even if she did not agree. And then I told her something I had never said out loud to anyone in my family, which was that I was done protecting a comfort that cost me my name, and to her credit, she did not argue. She said she loved me, and then she hung up to sit with a version of her marriage that will probably never feel the same again. And I do not celebrate that, but I also do not carry it, because I have carried enough. Mark texted a long, meandering apology that tried to split blame into friendly slices we could each nibble without choking. And he said he had trusted Dad and that the Friday signature had been routine and that he had no idea about the memo with my name underlined. And I told him I believed parts of that and not others. And that what mattered now was not whether he felt sorry, but whether he cooperated when the firm asked for his messages. And he said he would, and maybe he will, and maybe he won't. But the difference now is that my belief is not the hinge on which the door swings. The documents are, and that is the piece I wish I had learned younger, that feelings matter to families, but records matter to outcomes. And I am building my life around outcomes, not around apologies that evaporate by dinner. The Business Journal ran a careful piece 2 days later, not a takedown but a clear report that named practices and controls and dates. And if you are asking whether that felt like revenge, I will be honest and say yes, it did. But not because I wanted to see my father hurt. It felt like revenge because for the first time the public story reflected facts instead of charisma. And if you have lived in the shadow of a man who collects narratives like trophies, you know how rare and righteous it feels when paper speaks louder than a toast. And the calls I got after that were not from gossips. They were from women inside other companies asking how I built a system that could defend me when a person with more power tried to rewrite the past. And I told them the truth, that it took boring repetition and petty little locks and the stubborn belief that I deserved proof on my side. You want to know if my father called, and the answer is no, and I do not expect he will until a lawyer advises him to, and if he eventually tries the old lines about family and forgiveness, I will listen, because I am not a monster. But I will also remember that momentum is not morality, and that the legacy he loved was a story without me in it unless he needed a scapegoat, and I will not step back into a role that exists to absorb his consequences. And if that makes me cold in some eyes, I can live with that, because the warmth I used to offer was purchased with my own disappearance, and I am done disappearing. The board placed him on advisory leave, which is a phrase people use when they are backing someone toward the exit without pushing, and an interim team now oversees the areas he once ran with nods and favors, and my title did not change, but my authority did. Because when people see you hold a line under pressure, they start handing you keys they used to keep for themselves, and I am using those keys to finish what I started, not to punish, but to build a company that will not need a daughter. To burn her life down in order to be seen, and if you want a moral you can write your own, because I am not here to preach, I am here to say that sometimes the only way to make a room hear you is to speak in the language it cannot ignore. So yes, I handed him an envelope and I watched him meet the truth he had tried to outsource to me, and yes, I set in motion a process that will follow him into whatever retirement he lands on, and yes, I slept better afterward than I have in years. Not because I won some petty fight, but because I ended a long one, and the ending was clean, and the last thing I will tell you is the thing I tell myself when doubt creeps in like a rude neighbor, which is that he wanted a legacy and he has won. But the part people will remember is not the speeches or the staged photos. It is the night his daughter stood up, refused to carry his story one step farther, and made sure the truth could walk into the room on its own legs. And whether he ever says my name again does not matter, because the paper does, and the paper will outlive all of us.